My wife froze when I entered the hotel room where she was with her lover. I didn't say anything, I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just looked into her eyes, at that moment when they were both half naked, and silence filled everything that existed between us, which wasn't much anymore. I didn't ask for explanations. I just closed the door. Calmly. With control. With a pain that overflowed without making a sound. A pain that doesn't need words because it tears apart in silence. At that moment, I began planning something much more cruel than a scandal, a cold, meticulously calculated divorce that would strip her of not only my name, but every bit of the security she believed she had at my side. It's strange to think that betrayal happens while life moves at its own pace. While you are preparing dinner, or buying flowers to celebrate your wedding anniversary, someone is taking away your place in the heart of the one you love. And that's what hurt the most, the contrast between what I believed to be love and what, in fact, was just convenience. In the days before the arrest, she was different. Attentive, sweet, like the first years. She looked at me like before, laughed at my old jokes, touched me willingly. And I, fool, thought we had rediscovered our love. But now I know, it was guilt. She was trying to make up for what she was going to do, like someone giving a kiss before pushing someone off a cliff. I remember the feeling of the hotel room doorknob. My fingers trembled, in a cold sweat. Not because I was suspicious, but because I was excited to surprise her. A romantic dinner, her favorite wine, a special night to escape the routine. But when I opened the door, I was the one who was surprised. There, on still warm sheets, was the truth that I never wanted to see. Her body, so mine for so many years, now entwined with that of a stranger. A stranger who made her laugh softly, the same way she laughed at my nonsense. Her gaze met mine, and in that second, I saw everything: fear, guilt, despair. She tried to speak, but I didn't want to listen. Nothing she said would change the fact that there, in front of me, our marriage was dead. And even then, I didn't scream. I didn't attack. I didn't break anything. I just closed the door. Because I knew that moment was not the end. It was the beginning. The beginning of my revenge, of my silent justice. Because the love I felt turned into something much more powerful, the desire to see her taste the bitter taste of loss. I left there with burning eyes, but with a firm heart. Because I knew she had made the mistake of underestimating the man she married. And what would come next, she could never have predicted. Over the next few days, I investigated. I discovered that this wasn't the first time. I discovered she used joint cards to pay for dates, new underwear, hidden dinners. She financed her own betrayal with money from our home. And that's when I had the idea. A postnuptial contract. A document she herself insisted we sign, years ago, when we inherited my parents' house. She said she wanted to make sure that if something happened, everything would be clear and organized. Little did I know that that paper would now be the key to my freedom, and her ruin. While she continued smiling, thinking she could get around everything with sweet words, I was engineering her downfall. I gathered proof, dates, bank statements. I spoke to lawyers in silence. I changed passwords, protected assets, removed his access to what was ours. And she didn't even notice. Because the traitor's ego always makes him believe that he still has control over everything. I pretended to sleep next to her, but I was awake, listening to her fake sighs, memorizing her movements. Pretending I didn't know became my biggest disguise. And even with all of that, there was a part of me that wished I was wrong. That he hoped, at some point, that she would genuinely regret it. That he would tell the truth of his own free will. But she continued lying, smiling, trying to put out the fire with empty praise. Until I got everything ready, the divorce paperwork, the separation of assets, the clause that would leave her with absolutely nothing. And the night she hugged me saying, "I love you," I just kissed her back with a kiss on the forehead, as if saying goodbye to a ghost. The next day, she received the papers. His face, pale, read each line as if he were watching his own life slip through his fingers. She tried to argue, cry, beg. But all that came out of my mouth was a simple, "I'm just giving back what you gave me." And even then, it wasn't enough. Because karma, this one, has its own way of acting. The secret she had kept for so long now trapped her in a contract of her own making. I didn't need to raise my voice. Justice came in the silence of the law, in the weight of responsibility, in the coldness of consequences. But what she never knew, and may never find out, is that the real blow is yet to come. Something she could never imagine. Something that involves someone even closer than she imagines. And when the truth comes to light, when she discovers the last hidden detail in this whole story, perhaps she will understand that some betrayals don't just hurt the other person, they destroy the traitor completely. After all, did she really think that a signature made out of love in the past couldn't become a cold sentence in the present? Welcome to the channel. Here, we make something very clear: we do not support, encourage or romanticize any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictions created to show the devastating consequences that betrayal can have on people's lives. Our goal is to provoke reflection, not glorify pain. Now take a deep breath. Get ready. 'Cause what will you hear? It's shocking. Good story. His name was Daniel, a 42-year-old man, successful, centered, admired among his colleagues for his firm stance and impeccable ethics. He had built his career on patience and resilience, rejecting shortcuts and refusing any move that could compromise his integrity. He was one of those rare men who, even in a fast-paced world, still believed in the value of committed words and the power of silence before an important decision. His professional life was stable and prestigious, but what really moved him, what gave him meaning to continue, was the love he dedicated to the woman with whom he had shared his life for more than 12 years, Helena. Helena was charismatic, intelligent, with an engaging smile and a striking presence. She was 39 years old, a literature teacher, passionate about poetry and the author of 2 published books that, despite not having achieved national fame, had won over a loyal group of readers. Her sensitivity was almost magnetic. She knew how to listen, speak, and above all make people feel. She was the type of woman who knew how to decorate an environment with flowers and words, who could transform an ordinary afternoon into something worthy of memory. She and Daniel met at a lecture on art and philosophy. He had been forced to go by a friend, she was there out of passion. The connection was immediate. There was no need for games or prolonged silences. What brought them together was the clarity with which they looked at each other from the beginning, the sudden familiarity that seemed ancient, as if their souls recognized each other even before their bodies. They got married in an intimate ceremony, surrounded by true friends, spontaneous smiles and a soundtrack hand-picked by her. The first apartment was small, but full of windows and plants. He worked tirelessly, and she transformed the days into lightness. It was common for him to arrive late and find her lying on the sofa with a book on her chest and a forgotten glass of wine in her hand. Sometimes she slept with the TV turned on to some documentary that she promised to watch until the end. Daniel liked that. I would like to come home and find her exactly like this. The home they built was full of details that said more than words: pictures painted by friends, black and white photos, old letters glued to the refrigerator. Over time, responsibilities increased. Daniel received a promotion that required more travel and more out-of-hours meetings. Helena became coordinator of the college's literature department, which gave her a certain prestige, but also a greater emotional charge. They started to see each other less, but the meetings were still marked by silent complicity. Improvised candlelit dinners, long weekend breakfasts, laughter that still came easily. When she published her second book, Daniel surprised her with a secretly organized book signing, bringing together her former students, professional colleagues, and even distant readers who came just to see her smile. She cried with emotion. He didn't say anything. He just hugged her tightly, as if to say, "I see you, I'm here." Their house was large, spacious, with windows opening onto a garden that she herself cultivated with care. The couple's room smelled of lavender and books. A room next door served as Helena's writing studio, filled with notebooks, stacks of paper, colored pencils, and little notes that she wrote to herself, as reminders of hope. Daniel knew that this was her sacred space, and he respected every inch of that floor covered in creativity. On weekends, he would venture into the kitchen to please her with new recipes he saw in videos on the internet. She always laughed when he missed the point or overdid it with salt, but ate it all anyway, saying that what matters is the gesture. These small rituals, so banal to the hurried eye, were the silent pillars of that marriage. They had no children. Not by choice, but by circumstances. They tried, for years, in silence, avoiding talking to third parties. The exams, the appointments, the little hopes that died each month, all of this was experienced together, with dignity, with tenderness, with hands held in the cold hospital corridors. When they decided to stop trying, the pain was transformed into projects. She immersed herself in books, he in work, and together they planned trips, home renovations, cooking courses, walks in the countryside. They never said, "We gave up," they just recalculated the route. Close friends used to say they were the ideal couple, living proof that love can last. And they liked that image. It was comfortable to know that they conveyed this solidity. But only they knew how much it cost to keep a structure built with feelings as real as they were fragile standing. The following years were marked by discrete achievements. Daniel opened an independent consultancy with former partners and started working from home more frequently. Helena, in turn, was invited to speak in other cities, becoming a relevant voice within her field. Her trips, once sporadic, became common. She always came back with small gifts, bookmarks, specialty coffees, handmade notebooks. He, even though he felt the absence, supported everything. He said it was only right for her to experience the height of her own fulfillment, after supporting his dreams for so long. And he was sincere. Daniel was proud of her. Proud of his ideas, his way of seeing the world, how he touched people without realizing it. The nights, however, became quieter. Conversations took a long time to happen. Sometimes she would get lost in thought, and he would avoid asking. He believed that everyone needs their own internal spaces, private silences. The touch between them became more ritualistic than impulsive. Kisses given out of habit, warm hugs, affectionate words spoken with the urgency to maintain what was left of spontaneity. There was still affection, but the glow seemed to have hidden itself in some fold of everyday life. Even so, on his birthdays, he continued to write letters. And she continued to keep each one of them. They never stopped sleeping together, they never stopped celebrating important dates, or hugging each other at the end of a bad day. To any outside observer, nothing had changed. But inside, some cracks had already spread across the walls of the relationship. Discreet, silent, imperceptible, but real. Daniel noticed these cracks. But instead of questioning, he sought to fill them with gestures. "I bought flowers in the middle of the week, prepared coffees with drawings in the milk, left notes around the house." Small acts, like someone trying to rekindle a fire without knowing if there are still embers. Helena smiled, thanked us, reciprocated with hugs and kind words. But something about her was distant. A part of him seemed to have closed, like a locked window before a storm. Believing that everything was temporary, Daniel started planning something different. He thought about a trip. Maybe to the coast, or some rustic inn, away from commitments, away from phone calls, away from distractions. "I wanted to start over, or at least try. Not with demands, but with tenderness. With time. With presence." I imagined the two of them walking hand in hand through the sand, as they did in the beginning. Maybe there, far from the world, they would find what they had lost along the way. What Daniel didn't yet know was that that trip, that attempt at reconnection, would begin a sequence of events that would change his life forever. He was about to discover that sometimes love isn't broken by screams, but by silence. And the smiles we receive don't always hide innocent intentions. The path he chose to rescue love would lead him to something much deeper, darker and more revealing than any physical wound. But for now, everything seemed under control. Everything was still possible. Everything still worked. At least that's what he believed. Helena was increasingly in demand. Her invitations to speak came from renowned publishers, prestigious universities, and literature festivals that she had previously only dreamed of attending. Her eyes shone as she shared the agenda with Daniel, while explaining the topics she would cover and the colleagues with whom she would share tables and panels. There was a new vibrancy in her voice, a restless energy that stayed with her even on Sunday mornings, when she usually slept in. Daniel observed with a certain emotional detachment what, some time ago, would have made him immensely proud. Now, however, there was something subtly off. She smiled a lot, but those smiles were no longer accompanied by spontaneous touches. The kisses were drier, the hugs shorter, as if everything had become functional. He tried not to get attached to it. He tried to rationalize that the intensity of her career required an emotional concentration that perhaps, temporarily, would distance them a little. That week, she would leave for a 3-day conference. She said that she would share a room with a professional colleague and that the two intended to take the opportunity to review a project together. Helena had always been transparent about her travels, and Daniel never bothered to check details. There was a pact of trust between them that had been carefully constructed and had stood the test of time. Or at least he believed so. Still, that Friday morning, something in his gut nagged at him. It was not a rational distrust, but a visceral sensation, the kind that cannot be explained in words. The smell of her perfume, more intense than usual, the way she avoided meeting his eyes when she said goodbye, and the slight tremor in her voice when she said, "I'll be back on Sunday night, don't worry about me," left a strange echo inside him. Daniel tried to ignore the feeling. He spent the day immersed in reports, meetings, and connections. At night, alone at home, he opened a bottle of wine and tried to watch a film that the two of them had agreed to watch together. But he couldn't concentrate. He took out his cell phone, opened the last conversation with her and reread the messages from the last few days. All affectionate, all seemingly normal. However, something there seemed forced, as if the words carried an exaggerated, calculated care. As the night progressed, the restlessness grew. It wasn't jealousy, it was intuition. On Saturday, after a quiet morning and a rainy afternoon, he decided to go for a run. I needed to distract my mind. As he crossed the damp streets, he felt his head buzzing with memories and projections. He tried to remember when was the last time Helena had looked at him like before, with the kind of tenderness that cannot be imitated. He remembered the note she left on the pillow on common birthdays, the long hugs after difficult days, the whispered words that now seemed to belong to another life. That sudden absence of sincere gestures began to form, within him, a void that was difficult to ignore. At night, he decided to call. She answered with a slightly breathless voice, saying that she had gone out to dinner with colleagues at the event and that the noise was loud. He felt a noise in the background of the connection, something that sounded more like the muffled sound of a hotel room than a restaurant. He asked her if everything was okay, and she responded yes, in a hurry, ending the call soon after, saying she would call the next day. Daniel stood still, with his cell phone in his hand, looking into space, as if he had just received an answer that didn't make sense, but said a lot. On Sunday, the uneasiness evolved into urgency. When she checked her shared credit card statement, she saw a charge made in the name of a 5-star hotel that didn't match the event location she mentioned. The value was high. Something inside him froze. He sat down at the computer, looked up the hotel address, and confirmed that there were no academic events taking place there that weekend. His heart began to beat hard, but his mind remained in disbelief. He didn't want to judge before he was sure. Maybe there was an explanation. There always had been. Helena was his foundation, his story, his home. And yet, something inside him was finally beginning to give way. He packed his bags without thinking. He took the car keys and drove for more than an hour until he reached the hotel. When he parked, he stood on the bench for a few minutes, his fingers trembling on the steering wheel. He went up to the lobby like someone walking through rubble. The receptionist confirmed, without hesitation, Helena's name registered with a companion, without mentioning who. He said that the two had gone out for dinner and had returned a few minutes ago. The elevator seemed too slow. Each floor was a blow to the chest, a countdown to something he didn't want to see yet, but that he could no longer deny. The hall was plunged into silence. The door number seemed to pulse before him. Knocked once. No response. He turned the handle. It was unlocked. Entered. What he saw froze his body. Helena was there, with her back turned, dressed only in a light nightgown, her hair tied up carelessly. She turned around in shock and her wide eyes met his. In the background, a man still in bed was quickly pulling a sheet over his naked body. The air seemed to disappear for an instant. Time stopped. Helena tried to say something, but her voice broke. Daniel didn't say anything. He just looked at her, with a frightening calm. This was not a scene for screams, nor for scandals. It was a sentence. An end that didn't need any words to be understood. He took a deep breath, stepped back, and closed the door carefully. He went down the elevator like someone leaving a wake. He drove without knowing where, without listening to the music playing on the radio, without responding to the messages that began to arrive on his cell phone. His body was shaking, but his mind was strangely clear. The pain was unbearable, but there was something beyond it. An icy void and at the same time full of intentions. Because he knew that from that moment on, it wasn't just a broken marriage. It was about dignity. Of justice. Of reconstruction. And something that still needed to be revealed. Something that would change everything. Daniel did not respond to Helena's messages for the next 3 days. No calls answered, no texts read. Silence, now, was his only form of control. He needed time, he needed to breathe, to reconstruct his own thoughts in the face of the abyss that had opened beneath his feet. But contrary to what she could imagine, he wasn't in crisis. He was planning. With the lucidity of someone who had been pushed to the limit of pain and now needed to react, not out of impulse, but out of justice. While she typed desperate excuses on her cell phone, he consulted lawyers, searched for old files, rummaged through forgotten boxes in closets. And then, at the bottom of a drawer, he found what he needed, the contract. The contract that would change everything. Signed 9 years ago, at the height of good faith and blind love, the property division paperwork made it clear, any proven act of infidelity would result in the complete renunciation of marital rights, including shared assets. A gesture that at the time was seen as symbolic, a formality. But now it was a loaded gun. She didn't know. I would never remember that document. Helena never dealt with bureaucracy, she trusted that Daniel would always solve everything. She gave her trust easily, and maybe that's why she underestimated how much that man could bleed in silence. When he finally responded, it was with a brief message, "We need to talk. Today. At home." And she went, with her face pale and her body tense, expecting screams, expecting perhaps tears, or pleas. What he found was something much worse, indifference. Daniel was sitting there waiting for her, a folder on the table, papers organized, his gaze cold. No signs of anger apparent. Just an emptiness that hurt more than any accusation. Helena tried to get closer, but he backed away slightly, keeping his distance. She began to speak, in a low tone, searching for words that could justify what was unjustifiable. He said it wasn't something planned, that it was a mistake, an emotional confusion caused by distance, by routine, by needs that he didn't even know existed. He tried to rescue memories, promises, asked for forgiveness between long pauses and distressed looks. Daniel listened to her without interrupting, as if he were listening to someone tell the story of another couple. When she finished, he took a deep breath and, with one calm movement, pushed the papers towards her. Helena frowned, confused, taking the document. He read the first paragraphs with trembling eyes, and then stopped. The words printed there seemed to explode inside his mind. She looked up, panicked, and whispered, as if she couldn't believe what she was reading. "Are you really going to use this against me?" Daniel stood up, walked around the table, leaned in front of her and spoke in a serene voice, but as sharp as ice. "You betrayed me with your body, with your word and with your lie. And now what are you waiting for? Understanding? Forgiveness?" Helena tried to say something, but her voice failed. He continued, now more firmly, "I stopped being a priority. You became another person and kept me as a backdrop. But this isn't just about the bed you lay in. It's about every day that you chose to lie, while I continued trying to keep a story that only I believed was alive." She backed away, sitting down, resting her hands on her forehead, as if trying to prevent herself from collapsing. "I was confused, Daniel. I don't know how we got to this point," he interrupted her, this time more coldly. "You got to this point. I was pushed to it." A dense silence fell for long seconds, until she murmured, "This will destroy everything we built." And he, without hesitation, replied, "No. You already destroyed it. I'm just closing what's left." But he hadn't revealed the worst yet. Not yet. That night was just preparation for the outcome. Helena, devastated, left the house with her hands shaking, calling her sister, her closest friend, anyone who could try to understand how the situation had gotten out of control so quickly. The next morning, Daniel looked for her again. He said there was something else she needed to know. He invited her to coffee at the place they used to go on Sunday mornings, as an ironic gesture that she didn't notice right away. They sat in silence. He observed her face, now more haggard, her eyes swollen, her hands restless. Helena tried to look for connection in that look, but found only the rigidity of someone who had already decided that they would not return. He began calmly, without raising his tone, without rushing, as if narrating a fait accompli. He said that, in the last few days, in addition to the legal procedures, he had reviewed documents, contracts and old folders. And who, by chance, came across the tax returns from the last 5 years. And then, while she looked at him without understanding, he revealed the final blow: the apartment they had bought together, in their names, was paid exclusively with resources that were in his accounts, and this was shown as clear proof in the accounting, but that wasn't all. Daniel took an envelope out of his pocket and placed it on the table. "Do you recognize that?" he asked. Helena took the envelope with shaking hands. When he opened it, he saw copies of bank statements, and there were payments for all the trips, dinners and hotel reservations for the last 2 years. All made with the additional card he had left with her, the same one she used for household purchases, for the pharmacy, for everyday household chores. Daniel looked at her with a blank expression. "You paid for your betrayal with the money from our house. The money I deposited, month after month, believing I was building a future with you." She remained motionless, hands squeezing the paper so hard that it began to tear at the edges. The mouth was half open, the eyes were lost, as if reality had suddenly been ripped from the ground. She tried to deny it, to stammer, but he didn't leave space. He continued with a serene, cutting tone, "I could have endured the pain, the humiliation, even the abandonment. But I cannot accept having been the financier of your lie. You betrayed me and used me. And now you will pay for every penny." She stood up staggering, with teary eyes, asking to leave. He nodded his consent. As she left, Daniel remained seated, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. There, at that moment, everything was defined. But he knew there was more. Because, even after everything, there was a detail, a secret, that Helena still didn't know about. And that, when revealed, would change the way she would see herself forever. Because sometimes, the real punishment isn't in the loss, but in revealing how much you've lost alone, without even realizing it. The next day dawned with a heavy sky, as if time itself understood the weight that hovered between them. Daniel, with his bags packed, left the house that had been a home for so many years. It was not an escape, but a necessary displacement. The lawyer had advised him to keep his distance until the divorce process was officially underway. He followed the advice without hesitation. There was no longer room for nostalgia, nor room for retreat. The decision had been made, and now it was only a matter of time before the papers received the signature that would symbolize the end. But there was something that still worried him. Not a regret, but a need. A part of the story still needed to be told, not out of pride, but out of justice. Helena needed to know what she had actually signed years ago. I needed to hear from him what that contract meant. 2 days later, she called asking to talk, this time in a neutral place. They made an appointment at a discreet cafe in the city center, a small, silent space where customers spoke quietly and the aroma of roasting beans seemed to almost numb the tension in the air. She arrived first, with a tired look, dressed soberly, her hair tied up carelessly. Daniel appeared minutes later, wearing a serene expression, but without any trace of cordiality. He sat in front of her, didn't extend his hand, didn't ask how she was. He just waited for him to speak. Helena started slowly, asking him to reconsider, saying that everything had taken on a proportion that not even she could understand. She mentioned therapy, the years of marriage, the good times they had, and how much she still loved him. But it all sounded like a desperate attempt to rebuild on ruins. When he finished, Daniel remained silent for a few moments. Then, he slowly opened the folder he was carrying and took out a copy of the contract she had signed. He placed it on the table, pushed it towards her calmly and said, in a firm voice, "Did you read this, Helena? Do you remember this contract?" She took the paper, read the first few paragraphs with shaking hands. I vaguely remembered it. At the time, he had suggested it as a formality, to protect the assets he had inherited before the marriage. She didn't object. He didn't pay attention to the details. He signed trusting him. "I didn't think you'd use it against me," he murmured, unable to hold his gaze. "Well, you should," he replied, with a fixed look, "because this contract is the only thing I have left to prevent you from leaving this as a victim. You didn't just destroy the marriage, Helena. You hurt something that was much bigger than both of us, trust. And that has a price." She squeezed her eyes shut, holding back the tears. Not out of pain, but out of helplessness. He didn't love her anymore. It was evident. There was no more room for reconciliation. She tried to change the direction of the conversation, asked what the split would be like, if there was still any chance of resolving it without dragging both their names into a scandal. And that's when Daniel decided to strike the last blow. "You still don't understand. There is no division. There is no agreement. Everything we build is in my name. The house, the investments, even the car you drive. All the result of my work. And now, about your mistake. The contract excludes you from all of this. And I will make every line count." Helena flinched. This wasn't just a separation, it was a sentence. She tried to appeal to some remnant of affection, remembered moments, smiled awkwardly, begged him to rethink. And then he leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms and said coldly, "What if I told you that this was my way of preparing myself? That for years I felt like you were pulling away? That I noticed every silence, every absence disguised as routine, and that I waited? I waited to see how far you would go. I waited to see how much you would be able to use me without guilt. And I waited, yes, for the right moment." Her eyes widened, as if trying to understand what he was saying. Then he continued, "You didn't realize, but the card you used was monitored. I knew about every purchase. I knew about the hotels. From dinners. Reservations made on behalf of third parties. It wasn't chance that led me to you that day. It was planning." Helena felt the ground slip away. This wasn't just revenge. It was a cold, meticulous execution, constructed with the same precision that Daniel applied to his business. She grabbed the edge of the table as if trying to stop herself from falling. Her world collapsed there, in front of a man who no longer saw her as a wife, but as an adversary. Why didn't you confront me before? He asked, with a choked voice. Why didn't you say anything? Daniel looked at her, for the first time with a slight trace of bitterness on his face. Because you didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. You made your choices. I made mine. Helena lowered her eyes, without the strength to continue. But Daniel didn't end there. There was more. There was what she would never have imagined. And there's one more thing you need to know. One last truth, before we sign off on the end. She looked up slowly, waiting for something that would help her defend herself, maybe a chance, a detail that could turn the story around. But what he heard was something completely different. That contract, do you remember why it was signed? It was after the inheritance. But I asked for that not just for financial security. I asked because, months ago, I discovered what you tried to hide. Helena frowned, confused. Find out what? Daniel leaned over the table, bringing his face close to hers, and said with a firmness that chilled her spine, the first time you betrayed me wasn't now. It was 8 years ago. With a friend from your college. I found out back then. Photos. Messages. All. But you were going through a difficult time, dealing with your mother's grief. I forgave you. But I never told you. I thought I could overcome it. But it stayed here, and pointed to his chest, as a reminder that even the most sincere love can be manipulated. That's why I wrote that contract. Because at that moment, I knew that one day I would need him. Helena's face was disfigured. She couldn't believe it. The betrayal that he believed forgotten, buried, had been known all along. Daniel hadn't confronted her. He didn't ask for explanations. He just kept the pain. And he used it as an instrument to protect himself. She put her hands over her mouth, trying to stop herself from crying. She felt exposed, naked, ridiculous. All the moral superiority he had used to justify his last actions was now reduced to ashes. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Daniel, in turn, just took the documents back, got up from the table and said before leaving, I didn't lose you today. I lost you a long time ago. It just took me a while to accept it. He left the cafe without looking back. Helena remained there, with teary eyes, observing the remains of a life that she herself destroyed, not only with her recent actions, but with the sequence of choices that she never had the courage to face. At that moment, he finally understood that there was no way back. And the worst of all was knowing that, unlike Daniel, she hadn't prepared herself to lose. Daniel never returned to the cafe after that day. There was nothing more to be said, nor what could be explained. The truth had already been thrown like a blade over everything that was once built between them. He continued with his days wrapped in a silent routine, marked by phone calls from lawyers, meetings with his accountant and a new reality that, although still painful in some corners of his soul, was beginning to fall into place. His steps no longer faltered, his expression had gained the rigidity of someone who went through hell and came out the other side without losing his own essence. He still felt the weight of a poorly digested absence, but now it was an emptiness that served as proof, he survived. And surviving, in many cases, was more powerful than winning. On the other side, Helena was sinking into a process of slow fragmentation. The impact of the revelation about the ancient betrayal discovered by Daniel, something she believed buried in time, made her question her entire trajectory. She had clung to the idea that her recent failures had arisen from emotional exhaustion, from needs that she herself did not understand, but the knowledge that she had failed before, and that Daniel knew everything without ever having said a word, destroyed her in a way more profound than any material loss. She tried to keep up appearances the first few days, but the truth gnawed at her in silence. The pride that had kept her upright so many times was now the same that prevented any attempt at internal reconstruction. She felt empty not only because she had lost a man, but because she belatedly discovered that she never really knew him. And more than that, he never valued it as he should have. Her closest friends began to move away, perhaps out of discomfort, perhaps out of silent judgment. Her sister, who had previously welcomed her with some degree of compassion, now treated her coldly. No one else knew how to deal with Helena's figure, which had been, for so many years, a symbol of wisdom, strength and elegance. The betrayal in itself would be enough to shake her image, but the fact that she was a repeat cheater, and on top of that, with financing from her own husband, made everything even more humiliating. She started avoiding places she frequented, stopped appearing at academic events, and refused invitations. He lost the trust of colleagues, cancelled appointments, and deleted social media. Pride, so much his, was now the heaviest chain he carried. Daniel, on the other hand, was moving in another direction. One afternoon, as he was leaving a meeting downtown, he crossed paths with a woman he had only seen once before, during a corporate event a few years ago. He didn't remember the name, but he remembered the feeling. At that time, he didn't even consider another look other than Helena's, and that's why he filed the meeting away in some forgotten corner of his mind. But now, in that unexpected reunion, there was something different. A mutual recognition, a long smile, a silence between words that said more than any rehearsed sentence. Her name was Laura. She was an image consultant and had been hired to help with the visual curation of a company where Daniel was providing mentorship. They talked briefly in the hall, then exchanged contact details. Nothing happened that day. But something started to happen inside him. In the days that followed, Laura appeared at other meetings. She was discreet, direct, elegant. He had a sharp sense of humor and a sweet way of positioning himself, without ever imposing his presence. Daniel, initially reticent, began to allow himself small gestures. A coffee at the end of a presentation, a comment about a book forgotten in her backpack, a longer conversation at the end of an afternoon. And then, on one of those occasions, without planning or hesitation, he invited her to dinner. There were no ulterior motives in that gesture. It was just a sincere desire to be with someone who didn't carry the weight of the past. And Laura, with her mature lightness, understood this. He didn't ask too many questions, he didn't try to invade their silences. It was just there. Meanwhile, Helena received the progress of the separation process via email. With each new attachment sent by her lawyers, she felt more torn. The contract was irrefutable. She would give up her house, her assets, and a significant part of the investments that she also considered rightfully hers. He had tried to negotiate, but Daniel wouldn't back down. His lawyers were surgical, polite and firm. There was no room for emotional appeals. On one of the most difficult nights, Helena went to the kindergarten where she used to teach voluntarily. He sat on the bench where he read stories to the children and cried like he hadn't cried since his mother died. I didn't cry for Daniel. He cried for himself. For letting the woman he once was get lost among vanities and unnamed needs. For the first time, she didn't look for justifications. He didn't defend himself. Just felt it. 2 months passed. The process was approaching its end. Daniel and Laura now maintained a natural frequency of meetings. He wasn't in love, not yet. But there was something there that made him smile again effortlessly. He felt lighter. I no longer dreamed about the past. I no longer woke up in anguish. On one of their dates, while they were walking through the park at dusk, she held his hand without asking permission. And he didn't back down. They remained silent, as if they understood that the new does not need to trample the old, but can be built on the rubble with delicacy. For the first time ever, Daniel didn't think about Helena. And that absence was the greatest sign of freedom he experienced. Helena, in turn, received a visit from a new feeling, shame. No longer as a social burden, but as an internal conscience. He started writing again, not to publish, but to understand himself. He reread old letters, rescued forgotten photos, opened albums that he had avoided for months. He wrote entire pages about his mistakes, his impulses, his lies. And in the middle of one of the texts, she wrote something that made her stop for long minutes. The betrayal wasn't against him. It was against who I could have been. In that instant, she understood that guilt was no longer useful. He needed to face himself without indulgence, but also without self-punishment. Perhaps he would never rebuild the image he had lost, nor the love he had wasted. But at least she could rescue something from herself. The last meeting between the two took place in the lawyer's office. The final signature. No hugs, no speeches. A solemn silence occupied the room as they read the last terms. Helena signed with firm hands. He didn't ask for explanations, he didn't make promises, he didn't try to manipulate. Daniel also signed, without hesitation. In the end, he looked at her and just said, "I hope one day you forgive yourself." And left. Outside, the rain began to fall. Daniel paused under the awning for a few seconds before opening his umbrella. He took a deep breath. The feeling was not one of victory. It was peace. And no matter how hard the journey there had been, he knew he had done what was right. Because sometimes, losing someone is the only possible way to find yourself again. And, although the story with Helena was over, a new story, lighter, more sincere, more present, began to germinate in the silence of her new steps. The final signing of the divorce officially marked the end of a story that had already ended emotionally long before. However, as with everything that was once deeply rooted, the legal farewell did not completely end the remnants of presence that still occupied small spaces in everyday life. Daniel continued his life with discretion, not because he wanted to hide anything, but because there was no longer any need for exposure. The freedom he had gained was accompanied by a new, almost strange serenity. The pain no longer pulsed like it used to, but the echo of what he experienced next to Helena still reverberated, sometimes, on silent mornings or lazy Sundays, when time slowed down and thoughts insisted on returning. The difference now was that these memories came without weight, like scars that, although visible, no longer hurt. Laura became a constant but never invasive presence. She understood the timing of things with rare wisdom. He didn't pressure, he didn't demand answers, he didn't demand labels. It was just company. And that was exactly what Daniel needed. One night, after an art exhibition, the two walked to a dimly lit square, where the worn wooden benches seemed to carry foreign memories. They sat side by side, their eyes fixed on the movement of the leaves, and Laura spoke softly, almost like someone thinking out loud, "Do you know what impresses me most? You're calm. It's not the calm of someone who ignores things. It's the calm of someone who has seen too much and learned not to shout about anything." Daniel looked at her for a moment, then looked away. He didn't respond immediately. He took a deep breath before saying, "Because the scream, Laura, sometimes it's just the noise of what we don't accept. And when we accept it, the scream stops. The silence becomes more honest." That same week, Helena did something she hadn't done in years. She went back to the bookstore where she had released her first book. He entered discreetly, avoided eye contact with the attendant, walked to the shelf of local authors and picked up an old copy, yellowed at the edges. He ran his fingers over the cover, as if touching a forgotten part of himself. She remembered the day of the launch, the line that formed, the sparkle in Daniel's eyes as he took photos of her with readers. The owner of the bookstore suddenly appeared, recognized her immediately and, even without showing judgment, commented that he had been hoping to see her there again for some time. She smiled awkwardly and said she needed to reconnect with what she had left behind. The man nodded, without saying anything else. And in that brief silence, she felt something born, the need to start again. Not to erase what he did, but to write something that wasn't contaminated by wrong choices. A few more days passed. Summer was beginning to give way to autumn, and the city streets took on golden tones. On a Saturday afternoon, Daniel was invited by a friend to a discreet get-together, a meeting between professional colleagues at a nearby house. Laura was also invited, and the two arrived together, without fanfare, as always. The atmosphere was light, the conversation flowed between laughter and stories about business and life. At one point, while walking away to answer a call, Daniel approached a balcony that overlooked a vast, open field. The distant sound of children playing mingled with birdsong, and for a brief moment, he thought about what it would be like to have children. Not with bitterness, but with a kind of silent gratitude. Perhaps life had been designed differently precisely to lead him there. That same afternoon, Helena was sitting in the therapist's room. He had started therapy as a requirement of his lawyers, but had decided to continue of his own free will. There, in that neutral, safe space, she began to understand her motivations more clearly. She discovered that behind her betrayals there was not just desire or lack, but a distorted self-image, a constant need to be seen, admired, validated. And when Daniel, with his calm and constancy, no longer offered this as often as she expected, she looked to others for what, deep down, she needed to find within herself. In that particular session, she didn't cry. Just spoke. And, in the end, when the therapist asked what she expected from the future, Helena replied, in a firm voice, "I want to rebuild. Even if it takes the rest of my life." The following Monday, Daniel received an email. It wasn't Helena's. It was from the secretary of the lawyer responsible for the inventory of a former client of his, who had died months ago. The message was simple: the client had left a letter personally addressed to him, something outside the legal procedures. Curious, Daniel went to the office to pick her up. He sat down on a bench in the next square and opened the envelope. The shaky, elegant handwriting filled only half a page. He said that he had observed Daniel for years, that he admired his attitude, and that, in the last months of his life, he reflected on the value of integrity. It ended with a sentence: "Pain passes, but what you do with it shapes who you will be." Daniel put the paper away carefully, not knowing exactly why that message had affected him so much. Maybe because, on some level, he knew he still carried unresolved pain, even though he was at peace. A few days later, Helena ran into Laura in a downtown cafe. The meeting was brief, polite, awkward. The two greeted each other with a discreet wave. Helena felt her spine go cold, but she didn't look away. Laura, in turn, maintained her composure. When he left a note with the waiter to give to the woman sitting at the corner table. The paper just said, "I'm not mad at you. I hope you find what you're looking for." Helena read the message several times, trying to decipher whether it was irony or compassion. After much thought, he concluded that it was sincerity. And she felt something dissolve inside her, like a thick layer of guilt beginning to break away. The following week, Daniel received a box in the mail. No sender. Inside it, there was a copy of Helena's first book, with a new, handwritten dedication: "For those who showed me, with silence, that true love doesn't scream. It simply goes away." He read it, closed the book, put it on the highest shelf in the office. Not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that even the saddest stories can have a dignified way of ending. That night, as he looked out the window, he felt something different. It wasn't longing. It was freedom. And with it, came the certainty that, even in the greatest losses, there is always the possibility of rebirth. That phase of life, marked by loss, betrayal, justice and a new beginning, was now heading towards a new curve. And although the path ahead was still uncertain, Daniel knew that, for the first time in many years, he was the one holding the map. Time passed, as it always does, and what was once chaos was turning into a silent sequence of new beginnings and veiled goodbyes. Life is not in a hurry to return stability, it demands patient reconstruction, stone upon stone, until what is left behind becomes just part of the emotional landscape. Daniel followed, and didn't just follow, he flourished. His relationship with Laura matured with the same calm that he always cultivated in his gestures. They were in no hurry. They weren't building something to prove that it was possible to love again, but because, in the peaceful rhythm of mutual presence, they began to realize that there was room for lightness after the devastation. It was with her that he discovered the pleasure of not having to explain himself, of being able to exist without justifying past wounds. Laura saw it in its entirety, without having to assemble broken pieces, and that was enough. They started to share small routines, in no rush to transform it into something with a name. They traveled on weekends, shared books, cooked together. There was a type of love that is not made of urgency, but of constancy. And Daniel found in Laura the chance to live a relationship where the past was not a shadow, but just a starting point. One night, as they lay in bed, she held his hand and said softly, like someone who knows that certain words only need to be said once, "You deserve this. You deserved someone who wouldn't make you doubt yourself." He didn't respond. He just shook his hand. Because sometimes, silence is the deepest language between two hearts that recognize each other. Meanwhile, Helena was rebuilding herself in another direction. The loss left her naked in front of herself, and over time, she learned to face herself without masks. He moved to a smaller apartment, away from old memories. He sold belongings that he previously defined as essential, he donated books that he no longer wanted to revisit. She began teaching at a public school, where she was received with distrust by her colleagues, but with genuine affection for the children. There, amid innocent questions and curious looks, she rediscovered a kind of purity that she had long forgotten existed. He started writing again, but now with a different tone, less romantic, more raw, more human. One of the texts, written one sleepless night, went viral anonymously after being published on a literary blog. It was a story about losing everything without anyone knowing, about how guilt can corrode, but also polish. One afternoon, he received a letter from one of the students. The girl said she wanted to be a writer and that she read everything Helena said as if they were secret maps for life. Those words broke her in a different way. For the first time, she cried not out of regret, but out of gratitude. Because, despite everything, there was something inside her that could still be useful, that could still touch others. That day, she understood that starting over is not erasing, but accepting that living is often learning to truly forgive yourself. The reunion between Daniel and Helena happened unexpectedly, months later, at a literary fair. He accompanied Laura, who had been invited as a speaker on a panel about art and behavior. She was there to present a project to encourage reading in schools. It was an inevitable crossing of glances. Helena looked different, her hair was shorter, her posture was more restrained. Daniel noticed the tiredness in her eyes, but also a new lightness, as if someone had learned to move with less noise. She saw him next to Laura, and for the first time, she didn't feel jealous or hurt. He felt a strange kind of peace. He approached cautiously, they greeted each other with a short, polite hug. Laura left them talking for a few minutes. Helena didn't apologize, nor did she try to revive anything. "I just said it was fine, that I was rebuilding everything from scratch." Daniel nodded. He said he was rooting for that. Before they said goodbye, she murmured, "I never understood everything you endured in silence. Now I understand." And he replied, without arrogance, without rancor, "I also had to lose everything to understand who I was." She turned and walked away. And in that step away from him, there was dignity. The kind of dignity that only comes when you accept that there is no return, only new beginnings. He watched her for a moment and then returned to Laura, who was talking to other guests. He held her hand discreetly. And when he looked to the side, he saw the reflection of his own face in the bookstore glass. He was older, calmer, more whole. Months later, Helena's project was recognized by an international institution. She received an invitation to speak outside the country. In the letter he read on stage, he thanked his students, literature, and, without mentioning names, a man who, according to his words, taught him that love is not always what saves, but is always what reveals. It was applauded. And in that applause, he understood that he had rediscovered something precious, his value, without needing anyone's approval. Daniel, now a partner in a new consultancy, traveled less, but lived more. He decided to buy a house in the countryside with Laura, where they spent weekends reading under the shade of the trees. The silence there was not like the one I had experienced with Helena, it was a comfortable silence, full of presences. One spring afternoon, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, he received an email from a publisher. They had read Helena's anonymous texts and wanted to turn it into a book. He smiled. I knew she would say yes. Because now, she knew who she was. The cycle has closed. Not with forced reconciliations, nor with cliché happy endings. But with the feeling that everything had the right weight, the necessary time, the right pain. Each one followed a different path, but carrying the marks that transformed them. Because in the end, betrayals aren't just about losing someone else, they're about losing yourself. And the real victory is when you finally manage to go back inside. More mature, truer, freer. If you made it this far, comment, do you think Daniel did it right? What would have been fair in his place? We want to know your opinion, because each point of view can reveal a new way of seeing this story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss any of the next stories. And remember, this channel is against any kind of betrayal. Here, we show the consequences, not to romanticize, but to reflect. Until the next story.